Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kalithea Honey Processed Panama from Apollon's Gold. And there's the information right there. And there's the container right there. And Apollon's Gold, based out of Tokyo, Japan. And they were originally a suggestion to us by Polar Bear, so shout out to and thank you to Polar Bear for the suggestion. This is their second ever appearance on this channel, and you've probably noticed that neither appearance has featured their original packaging. And that's because we purchased both of these coffees from Dayglow, as this was their rare coffee offering for the month. And it is a high-end Panamanian geisha, so it's one that definitely caught my interest and was the main catalyst for this purchase. I'm definitely looking forward to discussing it, as this right here is day 49. And recipe they have for their coffee is a 17:1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 98 degrees Celsius. We went with something a little bit more concentrated at 16:1, also at 98 degrees Celsius. I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. However, we went one notch more coarse on this one as we were getting slightly better results from that. Roast profile, as we've kind of alluded to in the previous review, they roast really light by a lot of metrics and standards. This is definitely on the lighter side of coffees in general, so definitely lighter in terms of the roast profile. With all of that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. So day 32, first impression, and the cup came out pretty clean while maintaining a fair bit of vibrancy. So what I was kind of looking for from this coffee, given that it is a honey processed, was maintaining all of the clarity you would expect from a wash processed coffee while maybe having a little bit more of the vibrancy. And it did skew a little in the floral and citric direction, which is very much in line with the expectations for this coffee, with a slight bit of the floral cookie sweetness, the most defining characteristic from this first impression. Delicate yet vibrant, so it left a positive first impression. Day 34, ran it through the Chemex, and it is slightly more defined in the Chemex. So one thing I will give to the Chemex is it does hone in a lot more on the citric aspect, but it also gives it a little bit of this complex herbality. So it reminded me a little more of a bergamot as opposed to the listed lime that they have on here. In addition to that, there was the cookie sweetness yet again. However, it was a little bit more subdued. So it was another positive day, just a little bit different of a cup. Day 36, not quite as impressive on this day, as the cup felt very slight, and that's been a little bit of the issues I've had with this coffee roaster up to this point. Is oftentimes their coffees can feel a little too light, a little too tame, a little too delicate, as a lot of the Panamanian-like aspects are in the background, and it's in place of this kind of more tea-like attribute with the softer citrus fruit component to it. So it does open up a little bit as it cools, a semi-sweet citric component, which does become a little bit more common throughout. Day 38, raised the temperatures, and this is the best day I'd had to this point, as it really does open up. So the recipe did help, especially in terms of the temperatures. We just adjusted from this point forward on the concentration, as there was a lot more sweetness to the cup. The earlier floral cookie sweetness that we had mentioned became a little bit more pronounced, a little bit more vibrant on this day. Continues to cool down into that very lively lime-like aspect. Very much in line with the citrus as opposed to the bergamot, especially from this brew method. Florals a lot more highly pronounced on this day too, so definitely saw some positives from increasing the temperature. Day 41, worked with the more concentrated recipe, also adjusted to a slightly more coarse grind, and that's why we liked it slightly more coarse, was because at this time there was the most vibrancy we had experienced from this cup. A little bit more in line with that bergamot we had listed from the Chemex, in addition to the lime-like attribute. So a lot more citrus, but also to kind of complement that was this roasted tea aspect. It reminded me a little bit of the Hojicha Kit Kats, as I don't drink a lot of tea, but they have an oolong note listed on here, and that's just kind of what it reminded me a lot of, was that sweetness, but at the same time in a roasted tea manner. Florals in a lot more high measure, as this felt like a pretty citric floral cup yet again. So best day to this point. Day 46, last notes we have, and the cup did remain still on the slighter side of things. So what I was really expecting, given the honey processing of this coffee, was to have a lot more vibrancy to it, but it still maintained so much of its cleanliness and clarity that you could convince me that this was a wash processed coffee. At no point was it overly vibrant, and at no point was it sacrificing any of its clarity. A lot more of the citric aspects were a little bit more toned down on this day, and I think that just kind of helped with a little bit of time and rest. A lot more of the floral cookie sweetness on this day, with the citrus being a little bit more secondary, however still the most pronounced characteristic. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And 2 level 5s, so let's go through those real quick. The cleanliness level 5. Yeah, as we've kind of mentioned, there was at no point any sacrifice of the clarity in this cup. It's a very clean cup of coffee in general, definitely has that Panamanian geisha cleanliness to it. So it's definitely justified there. However, it's right there at that level 5. It's not one of those ridiculously wildly clean cups of coffee. So perfect there at that mark. Citrus fruit, level 5, and I think maybe the reason I was convincing myself level 4 was because on this day it's not quite as pronounced. This day it's toned back a little bit more. There were times where the bergamot or the citrus, especially as the cup does cool down, is in huge prominence, and I think that could be because of just how clean the base was. It is a very citric cup of coffee. On this day, not quite as much as it had been on previous days, and that's actually kind of a good thing because the citrus, not necessarily my favorite component of a coffee. Finish, level 4, yeah, I agree with that. At no point would I say that this isn't like an overly pronounced, overly lasting finish. It just does kind of finish kind of even with the citric component to it. Sweetness, level 4, this one's an interesting one because it's on the lower side of level 4, and that's probably going to be the biggest sticking point for me on this coffee. It's definitely more of a level 4 than a level 3. It could be a higher side of level 3, but it definitely had enough sweetness to justify that mark. I think I was just always looking for more given the processing method, but it's kind of right there at that level 4 mark. Acidity, it was a little bit more acidic than it was sweet. So that's kind of why the contrasting sweetness and acidity is one that's a little bit of a sticking point to me. Surprisingly acidic, but again, this coffee's pretty light in general, so that's to be expected. Florality, level 4, yeah, I would say that at no point would I say overly strong, justifying at a level 5 mark, but I've been mentioning the consistent note throughout, which was that kind of floral cookie sweetness that I was experiencing. I experienced that from a lot of lighter profiled cups of coffee in general, so I like it there at that mark. A couple of other things worth discussing. The bitterness, level 2, that's because of the citric bitterness that was coming from it. Savoriness, as kind of mentioned, has this like herbal citrus components to it. And then the body at a level 2, it didn't have the super light body that I think I might have been expecting, and that could be attributed to a more concentrated cup, the V60, as well as the fact that it is a honey processed coffee. I think if there's one thing that would give it away as not being a wash processed coffee is that it did have a slight bit more body than typical for Panamanian geishas. For the most part, though, I agree with this tasting wheel. I think it's pretty in line with what I was experiencing from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I think just like with the last Apollon's Gold coffee, I had really high expectations for it going into it, and I thought it was a good cup of coffee. I mean, it's a Panamanian geisha, so I really enjoyed the coffee throughout the time drinking it. However, it doesn't necessarily stack up to how much I've enjoyed a lot of the other Panamanian coffees, and that's mostly attributed to the fact that I couldn't pull out the type of sweetness I was looking for. Both of the coffees I've had from them, they felt a little tricky in terms of getting a lot of the sweetness that I was looking for, maybe some more defined characteristics to them. As the notes were here, they just weren't ever overly pronounced for me. So I think they're just maybe a little tricky to work with, and maybe a little bit more practice would get a lot more out of them. But I thought it was pretty good in general, just not necessarily my favorite from a very high expectation term standard. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, pretty simple. If you like the citric components, if you like the overly clean cups of coffee, I feel like this one was a good mix. As mentioned, it did have a little bit more complexity to it as well. That's one thing I can give it credit for, is a nice bit of depth and complexity, as it did have a little bit of stone fruit, which is something we didn't even really mention. In addition to that, the kind of more herbal, complex citric components to it, while at the same time not sacrificing any of its clarity. Still high on the acidity and still plenty of sweetness, so a pretty well-rounded cup, especially for a Panamanian geisha in general. So for the most part, I think I'll leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you enjoyed the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Kalithea honey processed Panama from Apollon's Gold. Thank you for watching.